preparing it for a while, as we have been thinking of collective projects on the subject of international politics of migration and in terms of crisis and different ways of approaching it. But before we go into the subject, I want to say officially that Christian Kaunert has joined BISA's leadership of this group from the July elections this year. So congratulations to Chris. Maybe you can wave, say who you are. Yeah, and then Foteini is continuing on a second term as being a secretary of the group, and we have also a third member who is Marilena Anastopoulou, who is a part of the postgraduate membership leadership. So for today, I would be really happy if everybody kind of raises their hand or smiles while I call their names so that we know the speakers. Very good lineup of speakers, scholars of migration, politics, and international relations. Franck Düvell at IMIS-Osnabruck and DeZim-Berlin in Germany. Sara Jong, University of York in the UK. Foteini Kalantzi, University of Oxford. Christian Kaunert, University of South Wales, me, Maria Koinova, University of Warwick, and Mariana H. Marchand at the University of the Americas in Puebla, in Mexico. So this session will be organized in the following way. We have a couple of large overarching questions that we want to tease out with regards to the idea about where does the international politics of migration stand with regard to times of uncertainty and crisis, and specifically to delve into these periods and to compare them to previous periods of this kind, which may be the long and prolonged economic crisis, the European large-scale migration wave of 2014-2016, but also we can go back in time and think even about 9/11 and other parts that have constituted this kind of period. So alongside thinking about migrants as some scholars like Greenhill put it as weapons of mass migration, there has been two major schools, especially in the European context, that have taken a lot to think about the migration security nexus. And these are the so-called Copenhagen School of Thought that has emphasized the importance of discourses in the securitization of migration, especially in terms of bringing extraordinary measures. And also at the Paris School with regards to how practices of securitization are handled. And they may follow from each other, but not always, so they might be very different. So what we want to tease out here is with regards to these two schools, but also with regards to larger ideas on the migration security nexus, what has happened with regard to the crisis of COVID-19 compared to others. And my first question is, how have these discourses and practices regarding COVID-19 changed? We know that COVID is going on in the world at the same time alongside other events and creating very much uneven processes of dealing with migration in its crisis. So I would really like to kick off the conversation by reaching out to Franck, who will probably be in a position to tell us something more about the power of states during the global pandemic and how this has really given them an important edge over any other actors in international politics. Franck, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Thanks, Maria, and hello to everybody. I'm really curious about the capacity of states to control migration. And I vividly remember an article by the leading migration sociologist Stephen Castles questions the capacity of states to control migration. Why states fail to control migration? He discusses, suggesting that migrant agency is prevailing here. And I have been studying irregular migration and transit migration for over 20 years. I've always been amazed by the capacity of migrants to overcome all these barriers and hurdles and controls, and at the end of the year, get where they want to get. But in 2016 already, after the so-called refugee crisis, we have noticed that the EU-Turkey deal has been fairly successful in diminishing migration through Turkey to Greece and Europe to a trickle. But most impressively, in course of the pandemic response, we have noticed that states had the capacity to completely bring international travel and migration to a standstill. And that kind of, well, brings to the agenda again this question for structure, agency, and to what extent human agency is prevailing here, or most possibly not. Because we have seen in Corona times, if states throw all their sort of means of control into the matter, then migration has been brought to a complete standstill. And the question now is, how are we going to conceptualize this, this finding in a way?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a long conversation about the retreat of the state from a very globalized world and the power that comes with that. And I think that Christian was interested in speaking about Brexit and some aspects of that additional stimulus that comes on top of the crisis.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you very much for having me here. I think the question about Brexit, it already intrigued me just after the vote when I had some conversations with people in the Home Office. And at the time, it became very clear that nobody had thought through in the Home Office how Brexit was going to affect refugee policy in the United Kingdom, in particular, the question of irregular migrants, and very, very much so in terms of the kind of migrant boats. The migrant boats coming across the English Channel have actually been an old thing. I mean, they've been there many, many years ago, and several years ago, they actually caused a lot of discourse and a lot of discussion about what to do with them. But over the course of European integration, Britain had been very well integrated into the European asylum system and was most notably one of the main beneficiaries of the so-called Dublin system, the very system that disadvantages Greece and Italy tremendously. But of course, for Britain has always been one of the very, very strong arguments in favor of European integration, as it were, at least for policymakers. And as it were, it was tremendously surprising how in the Home Office there hadn't been any thinking going on as to what would happen, because it was clear that after Brexit, Britain would no longer be able to be part of the Dublin system. The old Dublin Convention that created the system in the first place was no longer in force, and Britain would no longer be allowed to be part of the Dublin regulation as a non-member state. And from that thought onwards, I was very clear that we're going to see the migrant boats coming. And I remember having these discussions in the Home Office when they said, no, we don't think they're going to come, because you know what? Britain is rarely sending people back. Britain is rarely sending people. So why would they start coming now? Well, that's because at the moment they don't have incentives to come to Britain. But post-Brexit, they will have every incentive to come to Britain. And this is exactly what we're seeing now. And the most ironic thing about the whole situation is to see Nigel Farage going and, in a sense, observing these migrant boats and kind of saying, I have told you, I can see the migrant boats. They are coming indeed, when he was in fact one of the main reasons why they're there in the first place. Had he not been campaigning against for Brexit, those boats would have very, very limited reason. And of course, we're seeing the process where those who wanted this situation are now pushing for that situation even further. And this was very sad to see on the one hand, but on the other hand, we now have an Australian discussion where we're talking about what to do, bringing those migrants possibly onto offshore islands, a little bit like Australia does, although I'm not quite sure which island there would be for the United Kingdom. But I think I will end on that note and hand over to the next speaker, but I hope we can continue that conversation later.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very good that you show different actors apart from the state, like Nigel Farage and others. And I really want to pass on now to Sara de Jong, who can tell us about certain specific constituencies in the UK and how they are affected by COVID with regards to previous times in which they were treated.
Thank you so much, Maria. Just to give some context, I mean, I'm specifically engaged in an empirical project which looks at Afghan and Iraqi former military interpreters or other locally employed civilians that were employed by Western militaries. They are often seen as traitors in their own countries because of their involvement with Western neo-imperial military missions, and so they become refugees as a result of them. Some of those take asylum routes to flee, but some of those are also part of official resettlement programs. So I wanted to pick up on the point that Franck raised before about, are migrants able, in a way, against all odds, to still be mobile? And I think yes, to an extent they are. And to another extent, like Franck already indicated, I think we do see at the moment that the infrastructure of mobility, right, that is embassies, visa programs, flights, have to an extent collapsed as a result of the COVID crisis. So I'm noticing, especially with those migrants who are part of official resettlement programs, you know, who have been waiting for years on the list, all of a sudden, you know, their expectation isn't met anymore because visas are simply not issued. And I think what's really important about it is not just the kind of stopping in that infrastructure of mobility, but also that the crisis mode that has been kind of prompted by COVID makes institutions less accountable, right? Because it's very difficult. I think, you know, just to speak in the UK context, there has been a policy change where former Afghan interpreters can be reunited with their families in easier ways. But of course, now in this pandemic times, all of a sudden, the Home Office is delaying family reunification. And, you know, if you send a Freedom of Information request to the Home Office asking about, you know, timelines, they can easily say, oh, because of COVID, we had to suspend everything. And I think that moment of suspension is one, where political accountability is challenged. And I think secondly, Maria, to also pick up on another question you had, was about the uneven effects of the pandemic across the globe. I think we need to also look at the ways in which some migrants are already in more precarious positions, of course, you know, and the pandemic has exacerbated those to an extent. So if you think of people who are working already in precarious jobs, who are already working on frontline jobs where they might be either more exposed to the virus or become more precarious because their jobs, for instance, as taxi drivers in the nightlife economy, are taken away from them. Or asylum seekers live in shared accommodation, for instance, where they're more often exposed to the virus. So we also need to see at a kind of individual level or collective level, how are migrants already situated and what does it mean for their position once they're affected by COVID? Thank you.
So thanks, Sara. I mean, I wanted to add something to your point about the lack of accountability in this larger suspension period. And I think from the case of Bulgaria that I'm working on a common paper with Mariana and Tami Fakhoury from Lebanese and American University, we're looking into different ways in which COVID may have been or not a critical juncture for migration governance. And you could see very clearly this suspension of the refugee policies when you are looking into really a month even in the Bulgarian case earlier, where Erdogan in Turkey threatened, and he was already in preparation to open the borders towards Europe. So in a certain way, the suspension in Southeastern Europe, in Bulgaria on the borders that has been mostly marketed as a transit state, have been part of this larger European process, because I mean, the whole solution locally was not actually quite a solution. But the other part about the precarity it's interesting to see how a lot of the Bulgarian diaspora, especially people who are not very well off and didn't have a permanent insurance or permanent jobs and working precarious jobs in agriculture, etc., all over Europe, have returned en masse to Bulgaria. And some of them were considered actually threat or specifically more of a risk with regard to bringing COVID in the country. And yet the state has tried to turn it around and say, oh, this is a great state that we already have here after so many years of transition. And this is the state and its healthcare system that really matters. So it's not simply that securitization can happen in these very threatening ways. I mean, power holders, back to Franck's point, can really turn it around in order to boost their own standing in the place, even if they're challenged by a lot of different power from below and different protests and demands for resignation. So I want to pass it on to Marianne, who will tell us more about this conversation with the United States and Mexican immigrants with regard to the COVID period.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for including me. One of the things that I would like to talk about is sort of the position of Mexico being a transit country, being a sending country, but also being a receiving country. And so this has been going on for some time now. And with the new administration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, things have changed to a certain extent, which was actually not expected by many people, especially in civil society, because seeing him as someone more from the left side of the political spectrum, everybody thought that he would have a more humanitarian migration policy, and actually the opposite is the case. One of the things that has happened is that the Trump administration has pushed Mexico to basically do two things. One is to militarize the southern border to try to prevent the so-called migrant caravans from coming across the border and reaching the northern border with the United States. And also to pressure the Mexican government into accepting asylum seekers, in particular from Central America, who are seeking for asylum in the US, to remain in Mexico. This is known as the Remain in Mexico program or the migration protocols. And actually, I just saw in the New York Times that today the Supreme Court has said that it will receive, that it will look at the case of these people who are like around 60,000 right now at the northern border of Mexico, staying in tents for over a year already, in terms of whether or not this policy is legal or is against U.S. refugee law and international refugee law. So that will be interesting, but it's a situation that's pending. So what has happened with the COVID-19 crisis? Well, basically, I would like to make look at three groups in particular. One are the people who were crossing from Central America's Northern Triangle into Mexico. And because most of the borders in Central America, for instance, the Guatemalan border, but also to some extent, but less so, Mexico's border have been closed during the pandemic, a lot of migrants have refrained from coming. In particular, Guatemala was very strict, had a curfew, and so it was very complicated to actually cross the country. And so there were not that many people crossing the border until like a week ago, when there were calls for a new migrant caravan to start from Honduras onwards, although that one is now sort of also again stuck in Guatemala. The other two groups are also very interesting and have had very different responses from the Mexican government. One group are the people who are actually staying in detention centers. They've been picked up and they're being, well, basically, their stay in Mexico is been checked. They may be subject to deportation back to their countries, or they may actually be able to apply for some kind of humanitarian visa or refugee status in Mexico. But what has happened is that civil society organizations in Mexico started to basically a court case against the Mexican government, saying that the circumstances to stay in these detention centers were so abominable that they should be left out and at least be able to either return or to stay in Mexico, whatever, so that they would not be all concentrated in these centers. The Mexican government lost that lawsuit, but still hasn't really followed up on it. So that's one of the pending issues. The other group that is very interesting are people who have been deported from the United States into Mexico. And here there's also been an outcry because many people had already the coronavirus, were not tested in the US, but also were not tested when arriving in Mexico at the northern border. And so the question then is, well, if they're infected, they're going to their families, their home communities, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're going to spread the virus even more. And again, what we see is a sort of not very much of a sort of proactive or even reactive kind of action by the Mexican government. The authorities haven't really done anything about that. So these have been sort of these issues, and that's why my claim here is that the coronavirus in relation to migrants and migration is not really very high on the agenda of the AMLO government. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Marianne. Very exhaustive view of the Mexican case. So I really want to transfer now to Greece and maybe bring comparisons between the current period of crisis and what has been happening from 2008 onwards, and Foteini can tell us more about this.
Thank you, Maria. Speaking about securitization, we see that it's a process that justifies the emergency measures. And as Copenhagen School argues, the actor claims the right to handle a certain situation through the so-called extraordinary measures to break the normal political rules of the game by, for example, focusing society's energy and resources in a specific task. In the case of Greece, that underwent a severe economic crisis that was intensified in 2010 and afterwards, it was brought in the surface already existing issues that were exacerbated. And this dichotomy of we, they, Greek citizens, foreigners, and immigrants as a rhetorical construction has often been used in the context of the discussion about the economic crisis. And this construction of the migrant as the non-systemic and problematic element created an anti-immigration general rhetoric that swelled significantly in these times of the economic crisis. And most importantly, this crisis triggered further anti-immigration attitudes and practices, and the harsh austerity measures, for example, imposed upon the Greek citizens resulted in even harsher anti-immigration measures imposed upon immigrants. And parallel to the economic crisis and interrelated to this, we had the ascendance of the far right, and this contributed to the framing of migration as a security threat. For example, one of the main characteristics of the rhetoric of the Golden Dawn, which has been tried these days and condemned, for those that you don't know, was the persistence of on the criminal profile of the illegal immigrants, that they were an economic and national risk, a risk to public safety. Also, there were strict practices in the border management and in operations in the Greek cities, the so-called sweep operations, the operations Aspida, which is shield in Greek, against migrants. Now about the pandemic, and although it is a crisis with very different characteristics, it is transnational, it ignores borders and nations, tackling the pandemic in refugee populations has been done in the same context of securitization. And the key characteristic was the discrimination against the sections of population for emergency reasons, and we speak about the refugees. We witnessed making decisions to close borders to non-citizens because of the pandemic, for example. So we fall into this logic of the exception that is deeply linked with the sovereign states that Agamben also has argued in the past. So the sovereign power employs certain practices of securitization, producing this bare life, a life banned from conventional judicial and political structures. And also, let's not forget that the pandemic has resulted in unemployment of low-skilled immigrants in the current economic climate. Many of these low-skilled immigrants come from countries of the global south that they had very high infection rates and deficiency also in managing COVID-19, creating thus further anxiety to these people and problems who lost their family members or friends, and they were unable to leave their host countries. Yeah, I think I'll leave it here. Maybe we can discuss further.
But I mean, it's an interesting point about the securitization that you mentioned, of different ways in which you think about migrants prior to the crisis and after the crisis. I think that with Franck, we have been having this kind of background conversation about issues of securitization of migrants as a threat and as a risk. So do you want to take up something to mention here, Franck, and I'll follow up?
Yes, I mean, in the context of the policies which we describe as securitization of migration, I have been curious how low the EU, or specifically the Greek and also the Italian government to some extent maybe, can go. In order to understand better the dangers of securitization, I have been looking at a historical precedence, and that is the response of Germany, Austria, and other countries in the 19th and 20th century to large-scale arrival of Eastern European, mostly Jewish refugees. Very similar scale, like those we have seen in 2014, 2015. Also very similar responses, closing borders, criminalizing facilitators, setting up the first detention camps, which were already called concentration camps, openly declaring that these were meant to deter future migrants. Major difference was that at those times, Prussia or Germany, Austria were transit countries because people were heading mostly to the US. But I think this comparison tells us that we are now, with the securitization of migration policy, that we are now on an extremely dangerous trajectory where sort of looking at situation at the camps on the Greek islands, rejecting to rescue people in the Mediterranean, almost everything now seems possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good way in which you show that what is happening now and in previous crisis is not that unknown to people. We just we have like short memory, and I think Christian wanted to discuss a bit more about the comparison between the pandemic right now and largely with what was happening 2014, 2016 in Europe.
Yes, hi. I think one of the things that is particularly interesting, I mean, last year, myself and Sara, we published a book on security, refugee security in the European Union. And there what we saw is that largely securitization of refugees prior to the 2016 crisis was driven by practices, if you want, the following of the Paris School. It was primarily, in terms of irregular migration, primarily at the border, in fact, while the standards in terms of asylum legislation were actually increasing. So that was the general picture at the time before 2016, but something very important happened in 2015 and 16. And that was that certainly the refugee crisis started qualitatively changing the picture of securitization of refugees, in that they were instantly linked, thanks to some of the terror attacks that occurred at the time. They were linked and associated to terrorism. So it wasn't even so much of a discursive construction, but it was this linking between refugees and terrorism that really created a new dimension in the securitization of refugees in a way that made them appear far more threatening. And that was also picked up, and that's where the second qualitative difference was, by heads of state. We never had that before, that several heads of state were actively contributing to the securitization of refugees and linking them in particular to terrorism. I think that was something very, very different. Now, actually what happened as a result of that, it made Europe more vulnerable. Europe was actually very vulnerable. And in fact, the episode that we saw with Turkey, where Turkey was in effect blackmailing the European Union, was in fact one of the outcomes of that vulnerability, because all that Turkey did was in effect using Europe's own vulnerability against Europe. And because of that sense in Europe, there was a certain giving into that blackmail. Now, when the pandemic came, another qualitative change started happening, in that, again, like I said, the discursive construction of refugees was changing picture again. It wasn't so much about the refugee as a terrorist, it was now the refugee that spreads the virus. The refugee that we cannot bring in from the refugee camp from Greece, let's say, because they might be full of illnesses that are going to then spread in our society. So then we have yet another qualitative change in terms of the securitization of refugees. So that is of course something very, very disturbing, and we will have to see how that will go, because this provides yet another vulnerability for Europe that I'm sure will be exploited in due course.
Yeah, thanks very much, Christian, for this kind of like very focused overview. I wanted to bring from my research the fact that this securitization, which I observe now compared to other periods, is mostly with regards to riskification of who is moving around, because it's not simply the refugees that you mentioned, it is also the diaspora, it's everybody who is moving around. And instead of what we saw before, very targeted people in terms of groups, etc., connected, everybody who is moving, actually mobility becomes considered part of any kind of risk that needs to be managed. And while it looks very neutral in terms of how it is dealt with, right, it's very kind of soft-spoken way of dealing it, although the state really takes all of its power to combat it. It's not these huge and ugly ways of relating to everybody. It is the way through which the state really penetrates in everybody's life, including of refugees, including of diaspora, including of everybody else who is mobile and is not part of these populations. And I think that this may have longer effects that now we are not in a position to see, but this may have more systemic effects about how and who in what way my mobility is governed. So let me move to the conversation that Sara wanted to bring about how the locally employed civilians are viewed with regard to their deservingness now and before. So what is it that changes there?
Yeah, thank you so much also about for the previous points that were made, because I also wanted to pick up on what Christian mentioned about how migrants are now viewed as being contagious bodies. And I think also the historical that was brought in by Franck and Maria is useful here, because of course already in colonial times also racialized bodies were seen as contagious. And I think that's important to note. I think perhaps one of in these very bleak times, maybe two things that I want to pick up on that are slightly more positive is that in the whole discourse around securitization, but also around the deservingness of certain migrants, I do see some scope for at least settled migrants to make new claims to deservingness. So one of the things I'm seeing with regards to the refugee size study, but I think it applies across the board, is this idea that migrants and refugees as frontline workers are somehow more valuable than initially was recognized. So you get those stories about how they're making masks, together to contribute to society. And in a sense that puts them in a position to also stake certain claims to rights and protection. And I think another element in which we can see some maybe glimpses of hope is that even though COVID has very uneven effects, it has alerted people to the precarity of our bodies, vulnerability. And I think it has allowed some NGOs to take that up in their lobbying and advocacy. So I think it becomes easier in a sense for lobbyists to say, you cannot leave this person in Afghanistan because clearly there's an inadequate healthcare system there to respond to COVID. And even about Moria refugee camp, which of course is in an extremely problematic situation, I think. On the one hand, we see the kind of contagious bodies approach, right? But at the same time, it has also meant that sometimes, indeed, detention centers have released people. I mean, I used to volunteer in Yarlswood Detention Center as a befriender, and it's pretty much empty now. And with Moria, I think people are also concerned by the fact that people might be infected. And I think, as an activist, to appeal to health risks has given some new discourse that we can use and employ, perhaps in a productive way.
Okay, thanks, Sara. So we have another 15 minutes. Probably can handle also some questions and answers. But in terms of concluding remarks, we saw where the situation is currently, how it really compares to other conflicts of uncertainty and prolonged crisis. And now maybe we can look into how much really the pandemic is considered a critical juncture. So how much it really is changing profoundly all of these structures of society, to the extent that we can see, because we are right in it, right? In terms of the term of critical juncture, it's something that sets different policies on a particular path that they were never before. So in that sense, this is an interesting way to think about really our discourses, that the pandemic is something that has changed our life forever, and yet there is the new normal is a different normal, and when we emerge we will be in a different place. To what degree this matters for migration governance, for changes that we may be dealing with? And I mean, some of you may be able potentially to speak about the preparations of migration pact in Europe, and how does this really matter, and how much the pandemic does really change, or is just yet another variable that goes plugged into the long-term migration governance. So, I mean, I think Foteini had some points about the EU and the European crisis, so maybe you can kind of elaborate on that.
Yes, thank you, Maria. I wanted just to say that the prolonged times of uncertainty have affected the crisis governance in a negative way, in my opinion, in Europe. The EU has employed its funds and energy to keep migrants and refugees away. And now it's facing a real crisis, the COVID crisis. Labeling the situation in Europe as a refugee crisis has justified throughout the years the implementation of these particular measures at the European borders, announcing to the European citizens that the states are in a condition of crisis, in a condition of emergency because of migration. The European elites had the ability to take special measures violating fundamental rights. Let's look at the pushbacks, circumventing the normal rule of law, and in many cases, essentially displacing the political dialogue and the agenda. We see contradictions within this governance system as well, whereas refugees arriving at the southern borders of Europe are portrayed as a humanitarian emergency. In parallel, the same refugees are portrayed as a threat to the national security, identity, to health, and practically securitized migration discourses and practices contradict the EU's humanistic ideals and treaties. If we suppose that critical junctures have a dynamic force to bring about deep transformations, leaving behind a certain legacy, then this is not visible at the moment. For example, the destructive fire in Moria camp on the island of Lesbos in Greece that was hosting 13,000 people with a capacity of 3,000 people has not caused yet major changes in the migration system in the EU and by extension in Greece. The new migration pact that is on the table at the moment in the EU does not provide any significant changes to the already existing system. And migration governance at the moment continues to divide the European countries and exemplifies these weaknesses that we all know of the Union, such as the glaring lack of burden sharing. Additionally, the vulnerability and desperation associated with irregular migration have exacerbated smuggling and human trafficking for labor and other kinds of exploitation. Now, if we want to think what a better governance would be, I think that it would start from first shifting the political agenda, which will reflect firstly the true dimension of the issue and not treat immigration like a war incident, essentially reframing the issue. Secondly, by informing the electorate that European countries need migrants as a working force, not only highly skilled, but also low skilled. Belgium announced that they will need 7,000 nurses. Where are they going to find them from? And thirdly, resolving issues of burden sharing in the EU. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you very much, Foteini. I just only want to add here about the post-communist world and it's a kind of its own world in Europe, because these have been countries like Bulgaria, but also all parts of Southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe, like from Hungary or Poland or the Czech Republic, that have had a very strong emigration and people who have been abroad, etc. So they return during COVID, but they don't stay. And what may happen to this conversation is now that a lot of people have gone back because of COVID, and how much they can be reintegrated into societies is one question, and how much these societies that are really geared towards attracting back their immigration and being very adverse to integration of refugees, or even through the passing of their borders, needs to change. I mean, Foteini mentioned a very important point to think about the labor force, especially in aging societies and especially in Eastern European societies that have not only the aging problem, but the large-scale immigration problem that is creeping and continues, is a very big question about how you deal with new integration patterns, with new discourses, with new ways of welcoming diversity in our societies. I do not see this in the Bulgarian case. I see this very instrumentalized in the sense that the political leadership does not want to create problems with Europe, but against the backdrop of other policies, try to create buck passing around Bulgaria so that refugees do not come, or if they come, that they transit as quickly as possible to Western Europe. This is not simply Bulgaria, this is like the whole Eastern European space. In that sense, a whole reframing of the conversation and of the practices really needs to be done, especially in these societies that are demographically challenged. Okay, so I'll pass it now to Marianne.
Okay, thank you very much. In terms of how the crisis, the pandemic is going to affect migration within a sort of a Mexican context, and I always say, well, you know, you have these different flows, migratory flows and so on and so forth. I think in terms of governance, the governance side, as I already mentioned, I have not seen any major changes yet. That may, I'm wondering to what extent the next elections in 2 weeks' time in the US will affect a different kind of migration policy in response by the AMLO government. Because if Joe Biden wins, definitely the agenda for migration governance in the region will also change dramatically. And that may also then create a different kind of governance response by the Mexican government. So that is one thing, but that is very, very iffy and very uncertain in terms of what that direction will be. I'm assuming that there will be a little bit less pressure from a potential Biden government on the militarization of Mexico's southern border and in terms of the Remain in Mexico program for asylum seekers to the US. That's my initial sort of take on this. But I mean, again, it's, I don't know what is going to happen. On the other side, I think in recent times, basically since 2014 or a little bit earlier than that, we have seen a zero migration in terms of migratory flows between Mexico and the United States. That means that fewer people are leaving Mexico than are returning, and they're maybe returning either because they're deported or so-called voluntarily. So that has been relatively stable. But I do think that the economic crisis as a result of the pandemic will increase out-migration again. And so I think that will be sort of in the medium term run will be one of the major effects in terms of migratory flows, and that people will try to reach the United States despite the situation that the US is in right now. They will try to find some kind of way of getting to the US and earning a little bit more money. Because one of the things that we have seen is an increase in remittances since the outbreak of the coronavirus, since March of this year. So I think that will be a sort of a secondary effect of the coronavirus in this particular region.
Thank you. I mean, the remittance conversation is very interesting. Unfortunately, we couldn't kind of really touch on that, but it's very good that you brought it. Maybe the last remarks by Christian and then Sara and Franck.
Right, just very briefly in terms of what does the future hold in Europe, because a number of people have been suggesting, well, the European Commission is trying to really radically or semi-radically alter the refugee system by changing the Dublin system. I mean, it is a radical proposal for the European Commission, because I remember a couple of years ago when I was suggesting to the European Commission officials that in fact the Dublin system is at the heart, that this is actually a dysfunctional system in itself. At the time, there was a very strong, oh, no, it works, it's fine, it's okay. Now there's an acceptance in the European Commission that it doesn't work, which is good. However, having said that, I'm not convinced that it will change anytime soon, because of course, at the level of member states, while there's some acceptance of some member states that the system itself doesn't work, there's still a lot of interest at play here of certain member states that are clearly benefiting from the system as it is. And as a result of that, I think the change that will come will be much, much smaller than what everybody thinks. And as a result of that, I think it will take many, many more years to actually change the system as it is. For the UK, it will be even more complicated, being outside the system now and being, in a sense, no longer a beneficiary of the system. And I think the UK will be in a very unfortunate position for the years to come. For Europe as a whole, a few more difficult years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. So Sara, concluding points?
No, not many actually. I think, I mean, just to reinforce some of the points that Marianne was made about how changes in the national politics of certain states will of course have a huge influence, or might have a huge influence. And I would also count Afghanistan and the peace process with all its contentions among one of those changes, of course. And also just to second her point about the economic downturn that we will see in the wake of COVID, I think I mean, in a different context, I've been thinking a little bit about intersecting crises or compounding crises. And I think, you know, if you would just focus on the life of one person, you could already see really how compounding crises can play out. That's it, I think, for me.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And Franck?
Yes, well, as I've indicated in my opening remarks, I rather suggest that the pandemic is fundamentally changing the conditions under which migration occurs. On the one hand, the response triggers a global economic crisis. It means that hundreds of millions of people are thrown into poverty, and that should increase people's aspirations to migrate. On the other hand, we have seen that states have gained complete control over migration by bringing standstill. And I would expect governments to very carefully resume migration by also bringing in another layer of control. And this is all these controls about health checks and health issues. After 9/11, we have seen that whole countries have declared risk countries of origin. Whole religions, Muslims, have been declared risk groups.
Franck, do you hear us? I think that Franck is no longer there. He said that he would be. Are you still there? Franck, I'm sorry, because we are at the end of the conversation. We may need to finish and to ask.
Yeah, I think I made my point. So states will maintain a very high level of controls, and they are using the health issue in addition to political threats and religious threats and nationality threats to even more intensify controls of migrants. Thanks.
So thank you very much, everybody, for a wonderful conversation. I think we brought so many things from so many different angles and different contexts. Maybe now we can stop the recording process, and then we can ask for questions and answers.